Politics, religion, and old men. Kind of an oddball subject because most people don't think of politics and religion in the same phrase. But yet, back before the United States existed, this country was united spiritually. We had preachers who went out and preached politics, and they preached religion. In fact, what most people don't know is the 13 colonies were true democracies. Because they were small, they had multiple annual elections, which made it very, very interesting and very good opportunities for preachers in the Northeast to get into the act. And they did. They preached freedom, liberty to their congregations, especially the Sundays prior to elections. And since they had a lot of elections, they had a lot of politics and a lot of preaching on the subject. In Massachusetts, a state that we think of today as being very, very liberal, they were very, very preachy. They got down on the subject of politics. Would you believe that in the early years back then, that their preaching wound up in the next Sunday's newspaper for people to talk about? Can you imagine your preacher's sermon from last Sunday being in this Sunday's paper? That was a different world. They were so organized and so much into politics that the Minutemen were mostly preachers and mostly deacons from local churches. They were organized by the preachers. When we see them with the rifles, can you imagine going to church next Sunday, and after the Sunday morning service, the men would take off and go out and practice their drills, their military drills with their rifles. And meanwhile, the ladies were going down to CFC, the Confederate Fried Chicken, pick up lunch and bring it back, and they'd have lunch on the grounds after church, after the war drills. It was a different world. In those days, the definition of a militia was every man between the ages of 18 and 65. In other words, everybody was expected to have a rifle, or at least a gun, and to know how to use it. There were, however, men who were called exempts, men over the age of 65, who were considered to be not quite young enough to fight, but they could go out and practice anyway. One April 18th, a reverse 9-1 call went out using a gentleman with a horse by the name of Paul Revere. At 2 a.m., the pastor met with 130 of his parishioners armed that morning. They came out because a British column was heading out to find John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were in town. The men answered to their names at roll call. They marched out to fight against the strongest army on earth at that time. 16 of them died or were injured. Several of them were those exempts. They didn't have to go out. They could have stayed home in bed. Instead, they stood to arms to fight for the country they didn't have yet. Today, Lexington, Massachusetts has a Lexington, Kentucky, named after those men because of their sacrifice. It was for all of them. Because after Lexington came Concord a few hours later, because that British Army continued on because they were after the gunpowder that was stored there. And there they met 200 Minutemen. When that war finally was over, nearly 9 years later, a British general was asked, "What worried you about fighting those people?" What was it? General Washington? No, he was a wonderful soldier and a great man. Was it their cities? No, they were wonderful cities, but it wasn't that. Well, what was it that really worried you about fighting those revolutionaries? And it was the Minutemen. Because you see, to fight them, to defeat them, you had to kill them all. They didn't give up. Now you know a little something about our history that you probably didn't know before. Praise the Lord, they were there. Will we have that much courage?